What's on your radar today, Robby?
Well, Brianna, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention played a direct role in policing permissible speech on social media throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. And I obtained confidential emails that show Facebook moderators were in constant contact with the CDC and routinely asked government health officials to vet claims relating to the virus, mitigation efforts such as masks and vaccines. And I'm going to show some of these never-before-seen emails. What they help prove is that the federal government shaped the rules of online discussion in unprecedented and unnerving ways during the pandemic. Now, this has become much more obvious over the past few months, of course, following Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter. Musk granted several independent journalists access to internal messages between the government and the platform's moderators, which demonstrate concerted efforts by various federal agencies, including the FBI, the CDC, and even the White House, to convince Twitter to restrict speech. These disclosures, which have become known as the Twitter files, are eye-opening. But Twitter was hardly the only object of federal pressure. As these emails I'm about to show you made clear, health advisors at the CDC had significant input on pandemic-era social media policies at Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram as well. CDC bureaucrats were consulted frequently, at times daily. They were actively involved in the affairs of content moderators, providing constant and ever-evolving guidance. They requested frequent updates about which topics were trending on the platforms, and they recommended what kinds of content should be deemed false or misleading. You've seen the Twitter files. These are the Facebook files. In May of 2021, CDC officials began routinely vetting claims about COVID-19 vaccines that had appeared on Facebook. The platform left it up to the federal government to determine which assertions were accurate, as you can see here. Facebook's moderators note that some of the above claims would already be violating an implicit admission that the CDC's opinion on the other claims would be a deciding factor in whether the platforms would restrict such content. Facebook was clearly a willing participant in this process. Moderators repeatedly thanked the CDC for its help in debunking. Claims vetted by the CDC included whether COVID-19 is man-made. The CDC told Facebook that it was theoretically possible, but extremely unlikely. For months, it was Meta policy to prohibit users from asserting that the pandemic may have originated from a lab leak. The platform revised this policy around the same time the above email exchange took place. By July of 2021, the CDC wasn't just evaluating which claims it thought were false, but whether they could, quote, cause harm. Then in November, the Food and Drug Administration granted emergency authorization for children to receive Pfizer's COVID vaccine. Meta proudly informed the CDC that it would remove false claims, i.e. the COVID vaccine is not safe for kids, from Facebook and from Instagram. Meta also provided the CDC with a list of new claims about vaccines and asked whether the government thought they could, quote, contribute to vaccine refusals. The CDC determined that this label applied to all such claims. So it's important to consider the ramifications here. Meta gave the CDC de facto power to police COVID-19 misinformation on the platforms. The CDC took the position that essentially any erroneous claim could contribute to vaccine hesitancy and cause social harm. This was a recipe for vast silencing across Facebook and Instagram at the federal government's implicit behest. Meta frequently gave the CDC lists of pandemic-related topics that had gone viral, seeking guidance on how to handle them. And the CDC informed Meta to, quote, be on the lookout for misinformation stemming from specific alleged misconceptions. Meta also kept the CDC aware of criticism of Dr. Anthony Fauci, the White House's COVID advisor. One email warned the CDC that Facebook users were mocking Fauci for changing his mind about masking and then about double masking. The CDC replied that this information was, quote, very helpful. And now, if the tone of Meta's communication seems extremely friendly, it's worth noting that staffers viewed government employees at the CDC as their colleagues. They used that word to describe them. In one email, Meta discussed providing said colleagues with access to a reporting channel for COVID misinformation. The list of individuals with access included CDC staff, as well as employees at Reingold, a communications firm advising government health agencies. So this is just a snapshot of the messages exchanged between the CDC and Meta. They were numerous. They also had regular conference calls. The CDC, of course, we know, was not the only arm of the federal government engaged in this work. White House staffers also castigated Meta for not deplatforming alleged misinformation fast enough. President Joe Biden himself accused Facebook of, quote, killing people in July 2021. One wonders whether these condemnations from Biden and others in his administration, which included the specific threat of punitive regulation if demands for greater censorship were not met, influenced Meta's decision to delegate COVID-19 content moderation to the CDC.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. All of these reports pointing to the closeness of the relationship between government actors and these very influential web platforms are illuminating. And they're illuminating largely because so many things were gotten wrong and the incorrect takes from the government were amplified through these censorship policies. I guess my only question, my only little point of pushback here is what should have been done? Like who should Facebook have been looking to promulgate, to develop its policy with respect to COVID or any other kind of misinformation? Or should it not care at all about misinformation and allow everything carte blanche? I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm just asking what you're thinking about this. Because hypothetically, like in the abstract, if you had asked me a few years ago, if you had asked me before these real big goofs from the CDC, I would have said, well, it makes perfect sense for Facebook to not try to be opening like medical journals and figuring things out. They should ask people who have expertise, and the CDC is a neutral government body, and why not go by what they say?
Well, I think years ago we would have, or many people would have said, of course, the CDC is a neutral government body. Now we know better. We know that while a lot of the guidance put out by the CD was probably correct and probably helpful, some of it was debated. There are other expert people, there are other doctors who disagree with some of the recommendations, particularly relating to children and how long they went on for schools and for masks. Now, the CDC will always defend itself, and Fauci will always defend itself by saying, look, we were just giving our opinion. This is our guidance. This is our recommendation. It's up to you what you do with that. We're not compelling anyone to do anything. But what we found was that so many government agencies were just outsourced it to the CDC. Whatever the CDC says is what we're going to do. And I think it's interesting. You know, you can interpret this however you want. I think it's interesting that Facebook essentially had the same policy. Facebook talked to the CDC every day. Every time new stuff appeared on Facebook, they emailed the CDC and they said, what do you think about this? How should we handle this? What's your opinion on this? Yeah. Over and over and over again. And look, again, maybe you can say, I'm sure some people will conclude, that's fine, I'm glad they did that. I just want people to know that that was how their decisions were made. They emailed the CDC over and over again. They had conference calls with them. They let them know what was going viral and what people were saying. They were in the loop to a great degree. And then eventually, at the same time, you have Joe Biden saying Facebook is killing people. You had Kate Bedingfield, I think is her name. She was a member of the
press secretary.
The old press secretary. She went on television and said, yeah, if they don't take misinformation more seriously, sorry, we should change Section 230 to punish them. Mm-hmm. You have all of that in public threatening going on, and then behind the scenes you find out that they talk to them every day. Well, maybe they feel like they can't not but listen to the CDC.
Well, that's the thing, and some of this has come out with the Twitter files where you see actually a lot of pushback. You've made this point, and that they feel a lot of pressure from the administration, and it almost feels as though I'm not trying to let the tech companies off the hook. But it does feel like the baseline issue is that there is all this pressure from the government to conform, and that there are real risks per the Section 230 threat to not complying. And there's a way that consulting with the CDC seems like an effort to avoid liability, more so than kind of like a fetishistic obsession with just doing what the CDC says. And given that there is this government pressure and this interest in avoiding any kind of liability or culpability for what might happen, because misinformation during a pandemic that was killing people is spreading through your platform, I almost have a little bit of a difficult time in this instance, at least, saying, this is a Facebook problem, this is a Twitter problem. It feels like a Biden administration problem, not to mention that
I completely agree with
the latest Twitter files job, you made this point as well. It's CDC people, it's doctors being mad that they were lied to by other professionals in the government. So there is this, I don't know, I just want to complicate the narrative, not that you've been promoting this, but there's a narrative that kind of says, there's like an evil cabal of like government actors and left-leaning media giants and doctors, and they all wanted to do a misinformation and suppress your speech. And what it actually feels like is the government trying to avoid liability by having a maximalist approach to all of this. At the same time, it creates liability shields from the pharmaceutical company. All of the tech giants trying to avoid liability by just doing whatever the government says. And a trickle-down effect where the only people who actually pay are the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. But also, I think there's something to be said for the fact that the CDC does not have expertise in what the rules of the discourse should be. They have precise medical knowledge. So, it was one thing, even when we go back to the Trump era, when Fauci was one voice in the room telling Trump, well, here's what my opinion is of the pandemic and what should be done. And back then, Fauci himself was more careful to say, look, the president has to weigh a bunch of different factors. Mm-hmm. How costly, how destructive will it be to our society and our economy and our defense if everyone is stuck in their homes for weeks? Sure, he's judging that based on input from other people. I'm giving him the disease side of things, and then he or the other relevant decision makers get to decide. And that was appropriate.
Yeah.
At some point, it veered way too far in one direction where it was just, okay, whatever the health bureaucrats say is what is going to be done. And they don't have an expertise about, what the First Amendment doesn't quite apply here because it's a private company, but about how a climate of open inquiry and free speech we think is good for arriving at truth and not accidentally suppressing things that seem controversial but end up being correct.
But the consultation with the CDC wasn't saying, what do you think our content moderation policies should be writ large? It was saying, should we ban this kind of speech? Should we ban this kind of messaging because it's not medically indicated, right? Which again, all I'm saying is, I wonder, unless you think there should be no content bans whatsoever, which is a position one could take. If you think there should be some limitations at some point, maybe only in an exigent pandemic-style crisis, who should be asked? That's just the next level question. If we all agree that the CDC has demonstrated an inability to be consistent where we want it to be, who should Facebook and then be turning to?
I think that the most eye-opening email for me was when Facebook asked them. Eventually, they're not just asking, what do you think about these claims that we're seeing appear on the platform, but do you think they could theoretically cause vaccine reluctance? And then at that point, they were talking about vaccine reluctance for getting children vaccinated. Mm-hmm. And the CDC responded, well, anything that's not correct could theoretically make people not so.
Sure.
So the implication of that was going to be a pretty far-reaching silencing of.
The advice, the CDC's advice isn't wrong. It is true. To your point, it is true that any kind of thing like that could cause.
Well, although about that stuff, I'm not. I think the debate over whether and what the relative trade-offs are for young children to get vaccinated is more fully being discussed and debated, and really ought not to have been suppressed at all. Now the CDC itself is, as you just alluded to, is upset about information that was held back about boosters.
The problem is that the idea of vaccine reluctance caused an overreaction across the board. It feels like one of those finger traps that kids used to play with. I don't know who went first, but a kind of paranoia on one side or the other. Some people who are immediately just anti-vax zealots, some people who are afraid of anti-vax zealots, caused there to be a constriction that eliminated any and all nuance. So, lessons learned.
Well, great discussion. Thank you so much, Brianna. And if you want to hear more about the Facebook files and what I found, you can please read my cover story for Reason Magazine. You can find it online about efforts by the CDC to influence the COVID debate. Thanks, and we'll have more Rising right after this.